Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. You can help me by pressing subscribe and share it with family and friends. My guest today is a well-renowned Shetlander, John Goodlad, who spent his entire working life in the seafood world. He's represented Shetland fishermen, helped pioneer organic salmon and halibut farming, and even worked with Prince Charles International Sustainability Unit. These days, he advises two global seafood funds on sustainability. John also an author. His own first book, The Cod Hunter, tells the story of Shetland's 19th century cod fishers and was shortlisted for the Maritime Foundation's Best Book Award. Then came The Salt Roads, about Shetland's saltfish trade and how it shaped culture and creativity for over 300 years. His latest book, Food from the Sea, just out this month, looks at the future of seafood through the real lives of fishermen and fish farmers around the world. Hi, John, and welcome. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
Thank you. That's great. If we start, I would just like to ask you about yourself and your career.
Well, Jim, as you've kind of outlined in your introduction, I've been incredibly fortunate to have worked in this wonderful industry throughout my career. It's a great industry, and I would like to think that I've spent part of that time working in the sector, representing fishermen, being a fish farmer in my own right. But I've also spent a chunk of my working life working on issues of sustainability and environmental responsibility. You mentioned my time with the International Sustainability Unit, and what I do now, advising a couple of big seafood investment funds on sustainability criteria in terms of making investments. So I would like to think that I approach this podcast, as well as everything else, with a knowledge and experience of the industry, as well as a knowledge and experience of the environmental and sustainability sector. And the two, of course, shouldn't be clashing. The two should be meshing together in one, meshing together with a shared objective and shared vision. So I hope, and I do believe, that I come to this and to other things with an ability to see both sides.
Really interesting. It's given you a lot of, I bet you've met a lot of characters and interesting people.
Absolutely, Jim. One of the great things with the seafood industry is that it's still full of interesting characters. The last of the hunters, the last of the people on the planet to go out and hunt food, the fishers. And then the first of the ocean farmers. The place is just full of really interesting people. But not only the last of the hunters and the first of the ocean farmers, there's also incredible people working in the NGO sector, marine scientists, chefs, people working in the supply chain, an incredible range of other people, together with the fishers and fish farmers, who are all committed to make this wonderful industry truly sustainable and to achieve its full potential.
You've obviously qualified to speak about that because you've written about it. If I could ask you something for our listeners, John, do you class yourself as an author or a writer?
I've never thought about that, Jim, and I'm not really sure if I understand the difference. I suppose I've written now 3 books, so to that extent I'm an author. Obviously, it's not what I do full time. I still work as we've discussed in the sector, but I enjoy writing, and I suppose since I've written books as well as writing articles and blogs and so on, but the fact I've written 3 books now, I suppose that does make me an author.
I just wonder what you saw yourself as, but no, an author's good. And can you tell us about your books? I found, obviously not seen the last one yet, but are incredibly interesting, the first two, in their own way.
Yeah. No, well, thanks for that, Jim. The Cod Hunters was very much looking at a particular 19th century fishery from a Shetland context. That whetted my appetite for historical narrative non-fiction writing, and the Salt Roads, I think, was a better book. And as you say, it covered 300 years of the saltfish trade from Shetland, and it was told through the lives of interesting people, told through the lives of many artists, poets, writers, visual artists, musicians, who have all been influenced by that wonderful story of the sea. That book seems to have done fairly well. It was translated into Dutch and Faroese and is now out as an audiobook. But my latest book, Food from the Sea, the future of seafood, is a completely different book. It's not historical. It's not Shetland focused. This looks at the contemporary seafood industry around the world. And really, the trigger for writing that book is to some extent what we're going to be coming on to talk about today, the Oceans film. The trigger for writing this was, seafood's got a low carbon footprint. It's highly nutritious. It's the key to feeding the world. It should have a wonderful future. And yet it seems to be under an increasingly, an unprecedented attack from many quarters regarding its future. And my book tries to unpick why that should be. So my book looks at fishing and fish farming around the world. I range from, the book opens in Barra in Scotland, and the book closes in Mexico, in the Sea of Cortez. And I look all around the world, and I look at fishers and fish farmers. I look at people from the NGO sector. I look at chefs. And try to unpack why we're in this, what I term the culture wars of instead of the seafood industry and sustainability being woven together, it seems to be that we're now in separate silos, and it's so I try to unpack that in my book. The book is not an apology for the seafood industry. I call out the seafood industry for its many failings, both in fishing and fish farming. But likewise, the book is not an apologist for the NGO sector, and I call out where I believe NGOs have got it wrong. And so that's what my book tries to do. As I say, it was kind of sparked by what we're going on to talk about today is just one example of this polarization of views.
I know, my view anyway, John, with the first two, the Cod Hunters, it really made an impression on me how dangerous a job it was then and how many lives were lost with the Cod Hunters.
Absolutely, Jim. Yes, it's a wonderful and yet tragic and part of Shetland's maritime history, and many communities around Europe share that history. We have an incredible, in the seafood industry, and I think we maybe tend to forget about this a bit in the modern sector. We have a wonderful cultural hinterland, a wonderful cultural history. And I do believe we should be making more of that in Scotland. We're very lucky in Shetland to have the Swan, the restored fishing vessel. The Reaper exists in Anstruther, and we have the Scottish Fisheries Museum. And, that cultural heritage and cultural history is something that not all modern industries have. And I do believe we should be making more of that to show the roots of where this wonderful industry, this wonderful contemporary seafood producing industry that we now have, has these very deep and profound cultural roots. And I think it's a great strength for the industry, and we should be making more of that.
Indeed. The other thing that fascinated me with the salt roads, which we've spoken about, it talks about salt in fish on the beaches in Shetland, and I've tried to do it in the mainland here, and I had to stop because And as I talked to experts from Iceland that were advising me, and they said, no, there's too much moisture in the atmosphere. It won't work unless you dry them mechanically.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does make you wonder, was the climate drier, 150 years ago when thousands of tons of ling and cod were being laid out in Shetland beaches. So much, in fact, that every beach, and when I talk about a beach, I'm talking about a stone beach, not a sandy beach. Every stone beach in Shetland was covered by these fish that were dying. Was the moisture less? Was the atmosphere less laden with moisture then? I tend to think it had to be for the reason you point out. But of course, you had these hundreds of beach boys that were looking out for this first drop of rain, and they would quickly gather the fish up and put it under a tarpaulin. So goodness knows, it was an amazing industry in Shetland, and you do wonder if, and of course, climate change is a big part of my latest book. You do wonder if we're seeing in that very short historical period of fish processing a different climate now that means we couldn't do now what we were doing then.
Yeah, and they obviously got it right because they were supplying things like the Basque region, and that was the highest you could get. That was a real high standard. I dealt with the Basque region, but I could only deal with them wet salted. Now, I thought it was a real accolade to reach the stage where I was Basque approved for my wet salted fish, but I couldn't dry them. And you were in Shetland, they were drying them on the beaches.
I know. And it took a long time. The first 30 years of supplying cod to the Basque Country, the Shetland fish was downgraded. It was second grade. It was getting poor prices. And part of the secret, one of the first things that it was a man called Arthur Anderson who, said, as soon as you catch the cod, you've got to cut the gills and bleed them, because or else there's black spots when they're dried blood. So that was important. And then they also switched from using the cheapest salt they could buy to getting some of the best quality salt they could source. So bleeding the fish, getting the best quality salt, and then over a period of a couple of decades, perfecting the process of drying on the beaches and getting really good and expert at it. So it didn't happen overnight, but eventually Shetland dried salt cod was known as the Shetland cure, and it did get into the top grade in the Basque Country. So much so that the Norwegians began shipping wet salted cod to Shetland so as it could be dried on the Shetland beaches and then sold into the Basque Country as Shetland cured cod. So how the world's changed. The Shetlanders had got the niche best market in the Basque Country, and the Shetlanders were importing wet salted cod from Norway so that they could increase the quantity of dried salt cod. So an incredible story, but for people who are in the contemporary seafood industry, fishing or farming, and they're struggling to get a better market price and wondering about doing this, it takes patience. And for Shetlanders, it took a full 30 years to get the Shetland product up from second grade up to the best. So patience is important, as you know, Jim, in the seafood industry.
Well, one of the things that you're just taking my mind back there when you say that about the bleeding. I remember I did a lot of business with Faroese boats. Now that's Faroese boats fishing in Faroese waters and coming down to Scrabster and talking to them a lot and being on board. They're obviously, until they were able to sail, as they called it, export it, because they would sail to Scotland, before they would be landing to their own markets. And it would have to, a lot of it would be for salting. And they had bleeding tanks on board, like the fish washers on our boats. But they would have to, when they were gutting them, they would have to go through the heart. They would have to go through the heart so that when the fish was still wriggling and jumping, when it was in the fish washer, that would drain all the blood out, completely drain all the blood out of it. And that got to the stage where, you know, we have, our fishing boats now have to get their MCA survey. It used to be the DTI survey. That fish washers was part of the Faroese survey. They had to have that before they would get the boat approved.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you know, I think a lot of people, and I was talking before about our cultural heritage and this wonderful cultural heritage. I think many of us and regard salt fish as a kind of a, you know, modern fresh fish. We've moved on from the salt fish days, and that was kind of an inferior product. But to a large extent, we've kind of forgotten our cultural heritage with salt fish. I know in your restaurant, Jim, you did a little bit with salt fish, and some of the top class restaurants in Faroe and in Norway and in Iceland are reintroducing some wonderful salt cod dishes. And of course, in the Basque Country, salt cod has never been off the menu. It's the essential component for bacalao, which is one of the classic eating experiences in Iberia, in Spain and Portugal. So salt dried cod needs to be of the best quality in order to get to these best markets. And, you know, you go into some of the best restaurants in Portugal and Spain, you will be able to order bacalao. And for those restaurants, they need the very best salt dried cod. So I think we've got to do more with our cultural heritage to realize that salt fish, you know, wasn't an inferior product at all. And those people that still supply that market, including the Faroese, very much know that.
It really frustrates me at times now, John, when you get nutritional experts telling us that we should stop eating salt.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, they probably, you know, too much salt is not good for you. But of course, what all the salt is doing is preserving the fish and giving it a certain flavor. But in bacalao, of course, they soak the salt out in the 24 to 36 hours before cooking the bacalao. So, you know, bacalao, the basis of which is dried salt cod, the quantity of salt in the dish you eventually eat is probably not that much. Whereas I think our memories, very much in Shetland, my memories of eating salt herring and eating salt ling, and there was still a lot of salt in that fish when we ate it. But it's about the preservation method rather than the quantity of salt in the finished product.
That's so true. And you mentioned about chefs, John. I always felt salt is something we need. I always felt, I remember I got the advice from a real top chef down in London. And as he said, if you're putting the right amount of salt in when you're cooking, he said, the amount that one single person, obviously you're doing big pans of things, cooking, when it comes down to a dish, the amount of salt that every single person is eating is so, and it's infinitesimal. It means nothing. And with that, for the 20 years we had the restaurant in Scrabster, we never once had salt on the table. If anybody needed salt added, I felt I didn't do my job properly.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and that's something you see in many restaurants now. The dish is served as a finished product, and if you have salt and pepper on the table, then the chef, as you say, hasn't produced the dish. It should be perfect. You shouldn't need to add any salt or pepper. And no, you're so true.
I think it's maybe a cultural thing too, because one situation I'll take to the grave with, as the saying goes, I'll take it to the grave. I still picture it as if it was yesterday. I was in the Faroe Islands. A good friend of mine invited me. I was sitting at his house. His family were there. We were sitting in the sitting room having a cup of tea. The family were there. Children, there were 3 children. They were sort of running outside, just doing what children do, playing with each other. And I'm sure you've seen that before yourself, John. When the Faroese boats would be in here, tins of Quality Street and Macintosh sweets, they would go back home with a hundred big cases. There were every boat, they were mad for that Macintosh and Quality Street. We're in the house in the Faroes. The children were called in. There were plates on the table. They could help themselves. There was salt-dried fish cut into pieces. There was Macintosh Quality Street sweets. Every one of the children picked this salt fish, dried fish.
Yeah, incredible. And that's an example of an island group that's retained that wonderful cuisine, that wonderful cultural heritage I was speaking about. And still in Faroe today, in a supermarket, you can buy these packs of dried fish. Absolutely.
John, if we were to move on the film Ocean with David Attenborough, what was your gut reaction when you saw the Attenborough piece calling for a full-on ban on bottom trawling?
Well, I suppose the first thing I would say is it's an incredibly made film. The imagery, the cinematography, the narration, the music. It's an incredible cinematic achievement. So from that perspective, it's wonderful. However, from the perspective of portraying reality, of course, I was absolutely dismayed and despaired. The film presents one viewpoint. It does it incredibly well. It does incredibly professionally. But it's a classic example of something that I talk about in my new book. And I think it was a well-known editor of The Economist, a man called Jeffrey Crowther, who once said that what he did to attract readers to a story, he simplified and he exaggerated. And I think this film, which is wonderfully made, is a classic example of simplification and exaggeration. It's not a documentary. It doesn't even attempt to give a nuanced picture. It runs with one message and does it incredibly well. And it then simplifies and exaggerates.
You see, they're trying to ban something they don't understand.
Well, I don't know whether and this film, as far as I understand it, this is not the classic BBC documentary that David Attenborough has been associated with for most of his life. This is a film which has been financed by certain campaigning groups. So clearly there's an agenda even before the film starts. Now, do these radical NGO groups who are advocating a ban on bottom trawling, do they understand what they're calling for? I think it's easy to say, no, they don't understand it. I think it's worse than that. I think they do understand what they're calling for. I think they do absolutely know what they're calling for. But regardless of the complexity, which I'm sure they realize, they want to see huge areas of the sea where there's no fishing. And I think the ban on bottom trawling is just the start. They will then move on to other fishing methods. So whether they fully understand the situation or not, I think it's a very, very dangerous road that we're going down, reducing a complex situation to a very simplistic explanation. And I think where you find it in the world that you've got complexity, and then you come with a very simple solution for a very complex problem, invariably results in tragic consequences.
It's very powerful, John. Do high-profile documentaries have a duty to show balanced science, or is good photography and clever storytelling enough to shape public opinion?
I think if you're out to present a documentary and give both sides of a story, and then having done that well, you'll then let the viewer or the listener make up their own mind, then balance is essential. But I come back to my previous point. This wasn't the classic BBC documentary. This was a film with a particular perspective and a particular viewpoint. And the second point that you make is, is clever photography and good narration enough to change public opinion? Of course it is. It absolutely is. And I think the consequences of this film, unless we can get the message out that we've got to unpack this simplicity and actually point out that the consequences of running with a simple solution to a complex problem could be tragic and could even have unforeseen environmental consequences that haven't been properly thought through. In my latest book, I use a term quite a lot. It's called fuzzy thinking. And this is a term that I picked up from the controversial environmental journalist George Monbiot. He writes for The Guardian. And in the course of writing my book, I interviewed George Monbiot. And while he and I disagree on many things, we had a really engaging discussion, at the end of which I certainly more appreciated where he was coming from, and I hope he possibly understood some of where I was coming from. But one thing I was really taken with was this term that he used, of fuzzy thinking. He says it's a characteristic of people who mean well, and they're very often attracted to very simple solutions to complex issues, and they don't fully analyze the complexity. And then the result is that the simple solution to a complex problem very often makes things worse. And it's a consequence of what I say fuzzy thinking. You see the movie, you see a trawl going across the seabed, you see it coming up, you see somebody tells you there's huge environmental damage, and then you see bycatch going over the side, and you think that's the same for all trawling everywhere. My goodness, let's ban it. That's a classic example of fuzzy thinking. You're just grabbing on to a very simple solution to a complex set of issues in the mistaken belief that that's suddenly going to solve all the problems. And of course, the reality of complex fisheries management and ocean ecology is that it isn't.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, you'll be very fair with Sir David. He's not a villain, but is he telling half a story? When you've got the voice of God and a global platform, can that be really damaging?
Yes, it can be. And I mean, of course, Sir David Attenborough is not a villain. And the story he presents is not a lie. There are many instances around the world where bottom trawling in certain places, trawls are being hauled over sea bottom they shouldn't be hauled over. There's irreversible ecological damage, and bycatch issues are terrible. And so what he's doing, he isn't telling a lie, but he's just telling one very small part of a complicated situation. There are other examples where bottom trawling produces high quality catches with minimal bycatch and minimal impact on the seabed. That was completely absent from the film. So what he's saying is not untrue, but it's just completely and utterly unbalanced.
I mean, he singles out trawling, but says nothing about dredging, seabed mining, offshore wind, or industrial cabling.
Exactly, or the warming of the sea oceans, the acidification of the sea oceans. I mean, the ocean is facing some huge complex problems, and the creation of a marine protected area, which everybody thinks, oh, we've got to do this to save the oceans. In my book, I kind of say it's almost as daft as thinking we create a marine protected area and then we're saving the ocean. It will do nothing in terms of warming of the ocean acidification, and these plastic pollution, these big, huge issues. The establishment of a marine protected area within which trawling is banned will do nothing at all about this. And it's almost virtue signaling. It's almost a little bit like some of the left-wing London boroughs in the 1970s and 80s declared themselves as nuclear-free zones. It kind of was one of the classic examples of fuzzy thinking. It was utterly meaningless. It didn't address the issue of nuclear, the nuclear arms race. The borough of Hackney in London was a nuclear-free zone. I mean, it was just pointless. So, to create marine protected areas and think that you're solving all the problems is just mistaken. Of course, marine protected areas are necessary in certain situations, but let's be honest about what they can achieve.
How do you feel the fact that the ocean was launched with royalties, celebrities, the bigger NGOs, yet the people who work in the sea every day, like fishers and fishery scientists, were missing? Why would their voices be left out?
Well, I think that's because this was a film that had a message it wanted to get across, and my goodness, it got that message across incredibly powerfully. But it was presenting a very partial message. It wasn't setting out to outline the complexity of the issue. So therefore, having people talking and pointing out what I'm trying to point out now, that this is not the whole story, and the situation is really not as simple as you're portraying, would have confused the message. So that's why, of course, the fishing industry wasn't on the film, and a contrary viewpoint wasn't expressed. The many fisheries scientists, the many marine ecologists who completely disagree with the conclusions of that film, their voice was unheard. Likewise, the voice of Marine Stewardship Council and other NGOs who likewise disagree with this very simplistic message, their voice wasn't heard in the movie. But I'm not surprised, because it was designed to give a very partial viewpoint.
Do you see it as eco-propaganda? Is there a risk in celebrity-driven environmentalism?
Yes, there is. I mentioned earlier that running with these simple solutions to complex problems, and especially driven by celebrities that get a lot of airtime, can result in tragic consequences. And I'll give you one example of fuzzy thinking. Salmon farming was introduced in British Columbia about 30 years ago, and it brought well-paid jobs to many remote communities in British Columbia. It was producing a highly nutritious food that was popular in Canada with a very low carbon footprint. What was there not to like? But a number of American foundations believed that salmon farming at sea was wrong. And somebody in British Columbia, the way they described it, they said that millions of US dollars flowed across the border into Canada to fund a variety of environmental groups that campaigned against salmon farming. And these campaigns were headed by a whole number of celebrities: Leonardo DiCaprio, William Shatner of Starship Enterprise fame, Star Wars. Lots of these people fronted this campaign, and they started to get a huge amount of publicity. And I think the salmon farming industry just ignored it, because it made very little environmental sense what they were saying. Science could contradict the point they were making. But this campaign became incredibly influential, and so much so that it changed the minds of many people living in urban Canada. And of course, these people all have votes, and salmon farming was demonized as being a terrible industry with huge environmental impact. And the result was, not many people realized this, but a couple of years ago, Justin Trudeau announced that from 2028, in 3 years' time, salmon farming will be illegal in British Columbia. The industry is being closed down. Now, that's an example of an environmental campaign, eco-propaganda led by celebrities, resulting in that ban. Now, the tragedy of that outcome is that Canadians love eating their highly nutritious, low-carbon salmon. Canadians eat 70,000 tons of farmed salmon a year. It's very popular. 70,000 tons of farmed salmon used to be grown on their doorstep off the coast of British Columbia to the highest environmental standards. It's now being closed down. Not only will thousands of people in remote communities lose their jobs, but the Canadians will still eat farmed salmon, and that farmed salmon will now have to be flown in from Chile or Norway. And where's the environmental sense in that? So it's a classic example of fuzzy thinking having tragic environmental consequences.
That's really well put. That says everything what we're fearing. Is there enough public understanding on how regulated UK fishing actually is, John?
No, there's absolutely not, and I think we have to do so much more about that. I say in my new book that I'm not an apologist for the fishing industry, and I do call out practices that I regard as wrong in the UK, in Europe, and so on. But the reality is that in terms of fisheries management, most European fisheries, most fisheries in North America, and the fisheries of Australia and New Zealand are pretty well managed. Most of them are MSC certified. And we've got to get that message across, because in Southeast Asia, in the Indian Ocean and off Africa, there's no fisheries management. Stocks are being decimated. Slavery is happening on board some of these vessels. It's a terrible situation environmentally as well as from a human rights perspective. And another tragic consequence of fuzzy thinking is that, somebody in Australia told me that the phrase they use in Australia, where they're coming under increasing attacks from the NGOs in Australia to curb the Australian fishing industry, which is MSC certified, fishing sustainably, doing things pretty good, pretty well. And this guy, David Carter, says, what they do is they torture the best and ignore the rest. In European fisheries, we're maybe not perfect, but we're getting it pretty good. Whereas in much of the rest of the world, it's just chaos. And yet the consequence of fuzzy thinking is, and I'll give you another example, the radical NGO Open Seas has been campaigning to try and delist nephrops, to persuade British retailers to stop taking trawled nephrops from the British fleet. Now, that's not an MSC certified fishery, but it's beginning to take the first steps to become MSC certified. And sure, there's a lot to be called out in that fishery, but the industry has begun a process to try and get MSC certification and make itself better. But what would closing that fishery down, which if British retailers weren't buying British caught trawled prawns, what would that mean? It would mean a little bit the same as the British Columbian example. It would mean that the British people who love eating prawns would be getting their prawns from unregulated prawn fisheries in the Indian Ocean of Southeast Asia, where there's no quotas, where there's no regulation, appalling human rights abuses on board these vessels, or from shrimp farms where the level of pollution and the level of crowding really gives rise to some serious concerns. So where's the environmental sense in doing that? It's a classic example of ignoring the best and torturing the best and ignoring the rest. Tragic consequences of fuzzy thinking.
That's really an excellent way to put it. Frightening all the same. What example have you seen of meaningful change in UK fisheries?
I think if you take a perspective over the last 20 years, the UK fishing industry has changed out of all recognition. I remember the days when many people in the British fishing industry regarded the MSC with great suspicion. They thought this was interference in their industry by an NGO. And of course, the industry was plagued by overquota landings in pelagic as well as whitefish. The industry was poorly regulated. Spin forward 20 years, most UK fisheries are either MSC, fully MSC certified, or in transition to MSC, which is the globally recognized standard of fishing sustainably. All fisheries are properly regulated in terms of quota management, in terms of bycatch, all of the escapement mechanisms and selectivity mechanisms that have been introduced into the fishing gear are making the situation so much better than it used to be. One really good example is something called Smart Trawl, which has been pioneered by Fisheries Innovation Sustainability. And you've had Cara Bryson on your podcast before explaining about that innovation using AI and a gate on a net that opens and closes. If that can be scaled to commercial viability, it could, to use the hackneyed phrase, be a game changer in terms of bycatch and trawl fisheries. So there's a whole host of things that have transformed the industry beyond recognition in the last 20 years. The British fishing industry now is fully engaged with certification, fully accepts that it's made changes. It also fully accepts that it's got to do more. I mentioned the North Sea nethrop fishery. That fishery has got to get to MSC certification, and it's making the first important steps towards that. And I think as part of that 20-year process, I would pay tribute to the activities of many of the NGOs who challenged, controlled the seafood industry to make things better. I'm talking about WWF, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, RSPB, Scottish Natural Heritage. These NGOs who did a great job in taking the industry forward and making the industry go on a journey, which was uncomfortable, it was difficult, but it's the best thing that's ever happened to the industry. But I think where we are now is we're in a different place. Over that 20-year period, I think these NGOs that cajoled and challenged the fishing industry has a lot of grudging respect for these organizations. They accept that these organizations pointed out where the industry had to do things better. And they partnered with these organizations and they have made things better. But there's a whole new group of NGOs, and I call them in my book the radical NGOs. And I think a lot of people in the fishing industry question whether these radical NGOs actually believe that the fishing industry should have a future. That was never in question with the NGOs I've mentioned before, WWF, SFP, RSPB, Scottish Natural Heritage, just to mention a few, MSC. They wanted to work with the industry to make things better. So I think we do have a different NGO landscape from the one we had, in the last 20 years.
With people like that having power in the fishing sector, none, is this a fair fight or environmental bullying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be too simplistic to say it's environmental bullying. I think, everybody's got a legitimate viewpoint, and the radical NGOs, their viewpoint, I disagree with it fundamentally, but their viewpoint is as legitimate as anybody else's viewpoint. So I think, bullying, I think it's an unfair fight, given the celebrity, given the amount of money that goes into that particular viewpoint, given the Oceans film that portrays a very simplistic solution, given the celebrity endorsements. But I think the seafood industry shouldn't sit around grumbling and shouldn't sit around saying it's an unfair fight, it's environmental bullying. The seafood industry has got to get its act together. It's got to get its act together through demonstrating to the world at large, to politicians, to the wider community, to stakeholders, that it is a sustainable industry, that it's engaged in constant improvement, it's making its game better. And it's already done that and has to continue to do that. It has to be beyond reproach, and it's got to get its act together that we're producing the climate smart food with the lowest carbon footprint on the planet. We're producing food that's going to feed the world in the future. We're producing a highly nutritious product, and we're doing it in harmony with the environment. So we've got to get our act together, and I think, the SFF and the NFFO are doing a great job. Podcasts like this, Jim, are a great way of getting that message out to the public. I think the Skippenish band on the highly protected marine areas, the clearances again, that's a way of garnering music to support the seafood industry. My book, in a very small way, is perhaps trying to do something similar. But all of us, the seafood industry, has got to get all of this wider stakeholder groups, musicians, authors, seafood podcasters, filmmakers. We've got to get our message across. And frankly, if we can get our message across with a far more compelling message than the message that was being portrayed in the Oceans Film.
Alternatives to bans, MPAs, seasonal closure, gear innovations, you mentioned smart trawl and things like that.
Absolutely, and let me be clear, Jim. I do believe there are areas of the seabed where there are deep sea corals, where there's merle beds, there's seagrass meadows, where there's fragile and valuable marine ecosystems. These areas should be protected, and these areas shouldn't be trawled. They shouldn't be dredged for scallops. And I don't think many people in the fishing industry would disagree with that. But to glibly say that there's no bottom trawling in all MPAs is missing the point. Some MPAs were created to protect seabirds. Some MPAs were created to protect cetaceans. There's many reasons for MPAs. So to ban trawling in all MPAs, I think, is absolutely missing the point. Of course, there are certain areas of seabeds within certain MPAs that a trawling ban may be necessary, but let's sit down with proper marine science and the seafood industry and government and try to identify these and try to analyze these and come to a solution. And for those other areas, then let's continue to make improvements in trawling, in escapement methods, in selectivity, and so on. And I think, something that's forgotten in the midst of fuzzy thinking, something that's completely forgotten, another environmental consequence of banning trawling in 30% and 40% of British waters. It's another classic example of fuzzy thinking. So you ban trawling. Simple solution. Everybody understands it. Isn't life going to be wonderful? All you do is displace that trawling effort to the rest of the sea. So the non-MPA areas are going to be fished more intensively. There's going to be a greater environmental impact on the outside the areas within which fishing has been banned. So there will be an environmental consequence of running with a very simple solution. Another classic example of not thinking this through, fuzzy thinking.
What does just transition mean to you, John, and how should it apply to the debate over banning trawl in UK MPAs?
Well, I think just transition, I think, has got to be comprehensive, and I think the just transition to better protect our marine environment through trawling bans, just transition to have more selective fisheries and better conserve fish stocks, just transition to ensure that every single UK fishery is fully MSC certified. That just transition has got to be undertaken in partnership with the seafood industry. We've achieved so much in the last 20 years. with NGOs partnering with the seafood industry and getting the industry to move to a better place. That's achieved so much. That's the template for the rest of the work that needs to be done. The way not to do it is to impose ill thought out, simple measures as a consequence of all of the emotional noise created by a movie, by a film. In doing that, you will create tragic consequences for fishing communities and for the environment. So we need to do this in partnership. So for me, just transition means make further progress towards fishing sustainably and looking after our marine environment with the fishing industry working along with the NGO community and government.
Excellent. Is there any real common ground between the fishing industry and NGOs campaigning to ban trawling? And if so, how could it be used to find a practical way forward?
Well, see, I think there is. I think there's huge common ground between the fishing industry and the NGO community. And I've mentioned a whole number of NGOs that have worked with the fishing industry over the last 20 years. However, there are some NGOs, I've mentioned Open Seas, there's Blue Marine and there's Oceana, who seem to be running with this let's ban bottom trawling in all MPAs narrative. And I do believe that by taking that simplistic approach, almost saying it doesn't matter what happens to the fishing industry, ignoring the fact that there will be displacement of fishing effort and the environmental consequences of that, I think these NGOs are indulging in fuzzy thinking. They're not thinking through what they're doing. So I'm not confident that the seafood industry can work with these organizations unless these organizations acknowledge that the seafood industry and trawling have a place in the future. Of course, there are areas that trawling and dredging should be banned. And, one example I use in my book, that the shell fishing around Shetland is tightly regulated by something called the Shetland Regulating Order. It was a classic example of a community-based bottom-up fisheries management regime. You need a permit to fish for shellfish within 6 miles of Shetland. There's a whole range of measures. You're only allowed to fish with so many dredges per side. There's limitations on, there's minimum landing sizes, which are greater than the UK minimum landing sizes. There's closed seasons for fishing velvet crabs. And there's a whole host of mechanisms. So much so, it's so well managed that scallops from Shetland and brown crabs from Shetland are MSC certified. It's the only scallop fishery in Europe that's MSC certified. And as part of that management regime, there are 16 areas within which scallop dredging is banned. There are 16 protected areas, no-go areas. And these have been done with agreement of the fishing industry in Shetland. So it shows that the seafood industry is not opposed to banning fishing in certain areas. And it's that kind of bottom-up approach that works. And I think that's the kind of example. And, Scottish Natural Heritage were instrumental in getting the Shetland Regulating Order off the ground. And I would pay fulsome tribute to their role in that process. And that was a classic example of an NGO and other NGO organizations working with the fishing industry to make things better, rather than simply saying, let's ban this, let's ban that. And we've now got a highly regulated industry. Shellfish stocks are in good shape. Shellfish fishing is profitable and it's MSC certified. And the seabed is being protected. What's there not to like?
Really, really interesting, John. It's a great way you put that across. A policy is increasingly shaped by public pressure. How do we ensure that science stays at the heart of the conversation?
I think that's so important. And of course, public opinion is very, very important. And there are many examples of where public policy has been dictated by public opinion, not science. I mentioned the example of salmon farming being banned in British Columbia. There's no scientific justification for banning open sea pen farming in British Columbia. That narrative has been driven by millions of dollars spent by environmental NGOs, hosted by celebrities and fronted by celebrities. It shaped public opinion, and public opinion led to a policy change with no scientific input. Now, we're in danger of the same happening with fishing in Europe, I do believe, and certainly in the UK. So what we've got to do is to try and make sure that the message that I spoke about earlier, the message that the seafood industry in the UK is sustainable, but there's still more work to be done, and we're working with the NGO community to achieve that. We've got to get that message across. So as well as science being at the heart of that debate and continually telling fishery departments and politicians that it has to be science-based decisions, we've got to do more to get our own message out. And we've got to be aware that in a world of increasing regulation, and many fishermen I speak to, many fishers I speak to and fish farmers complain about the level of regulation now that used to be the case 20 years ago. And I just say, well, that's the world we live in. But do you know what? The most important license of all, the one that you have to get, is the most difficult one to get hold of and the most difficult one to achieve and to hold on to, and that's the social license to operate. We've got to have the great British public accepting that to produce seafood in a sustainable manner, we've got to have a fishing industry, and we've got to have a fish farming industry. And we've got to make sure that we hold on to that social license, that people accept that all kinds of food production have some kind of environmental impact. To produce any kind of food without an environmental impact doesn't exist. And in my book, I used the example. I was astonished when I found this out. I was visiting an organic trout farm north that was on the road to getting certification from ASC north of Mexico City. And this was an area that 10 years ago was very rich, very fertile, an area of mixed small farms, ideal for growing avocados. A lot of money to be made in growing avocados, apparently. Huge demand in Europe and America. To produce a single avocado takes 60 litres of water for one single avocado. A lot of American agribusinesses came in, bought up the small farms, turned the area into a single crop farming enterprise, producing only avocados. The net result was that the water table was reduced by several hundred meters. That wonderful verdant landscape is now a parched, semi-desert landscape. That's the consequence of the kind of environmental impact that can happen on land. And we sometimes forget about that to produce avocados, so favoured in many vegan and vegetarian cafes. And of course, every kind of food production has an impact, but we've got to get the message across that producing seafood has a lower environmental impact than many other forms of food production. And the greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing seafood, whether farmed or wild caught, is so much lower than beef, lamb, pork, or chicken. It's incredibly low. And we've got to get that message across so that we hold on to the social license that the great British public says, well, actually, in terms of food production, the carbon footprint and the environmental impact of fishing and fish farming is actually a lot less than land-based farming in many circumstances. And this is an industry we have to hold on to for good environmental reasons, as well as the fact it's producing a good product that we like to eat.
That's fantastic. Really interesting to hear. Listen, trawling and food security. Can we feed a growing population without bottom trawling?
Maybe let's take a really long-term perspective, 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line. It may be the case that by that time, there will be alternative fishing techniques that can catch all the fish that's been caught by bottom trawling at the moment. Maybe biodegradable gill nets that, if they're lost, biodegrade and don't continue to ghost fish. Maybe long lining, maybe hand lining. Instead of scallop dredging, maybe the scallop discos, where scallops are encouraged to come into these large creels by a combination of lights. A lot of people listening to this will say, that's just fantasy, John. That might never happen. And they might be right. It might never happen. But possibly in the longer term, there will be an alternative to bottom trawling. And certainly in the meantime, we have to make bottom trawling less impactful on the seabed, trawl doors that don't scour the seabed. We've got to improve selectivity. We've got to do all of that to make the impact of trawling much less. But if we suddenly ban trawling around the world, all trawling, I think 30 million tons of the 100 million tons of seafood that's produced around the world, 30 million tons is produced by trawling. So let's say we take 30 million tons, as from a week on Monday, out of the global food production system. How do we replace that food? Well, if we try to replace 30 million tons of fish that's caught by trawling around the world, we will have to cut down more rainforest to create more land. We will have to use even more fertilizer on our land to push that land to produce even more than it does at the moment. We'll probably have to move more towards GM crops. We'll certainly have to use more fresh water than we use at the moment, with the kind of catastrophic consequences that I saw with my own eyes in Mexico. So we'll push, if we ban trawling around the world and have to replace that seafood with food from the land, the environmental consequences will be, in my view, catastrophic. So we need to improve our game. We need to make the impact of bottom trawling less in certain areas, and we've got to ban bottom trawling where there should be no seabed contact at all in certain areas. But to simply ban bottom trawling as a simple solution to a complex problem, it's another example of fuzzy thinking, that if we did that, we would then wreak a degree of environmental catastrophe on our land that people, I think, haven't even begun to realise what that would mean.
Very powerful. My fear is if we were to ban bottom trawling here, we would just end up importing it, still trawled, but from countries with lower standards than ours. And it's just exactly what you said about the salmon farming, and is it either Canada or America? And we would be flying it or shipping it. So there'd be a bigger carbon footprint added. So as you say, John, where's the logic in that?
Absolutely. And I made the example of the UK nephrops fishery. You know, if we ban a fishery that maybe isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it used to be, and it's engaged with the NGO community in making itself better. Instead of working with that industry to continue that process, if we simply ban it, then we'll either lead to a greater production of land-based protein to replace the seafood, or, as you've said, and as I used earlier, the example of North Sea nephrops. What we'll do is, if we were banning North Sea nephrops trawl fishing in the UK, it would probably result in the complete overfishing and of some shrimp stocks in the Indian Ocean, which are desperately overfished at the moment, and it would probably push these stocks over the limit. Is that the environmental consequence that the people who advocate a ban on trawling nephrops really want to see? Have they thought this through, or is this just another example of fuzzy thinking?
Very, very powerful. It just makes you wonder what's going on. I asked AI to pick a question for the series, John, and he called it a challenge to Attenborough. If you had 5 minutes to face-to-face with Sir David, what would you say?
I think what I would say is, Sir David Attenborough is a wonderful broadcaster, but he's also more than a good broadcaster. He understands the environment, the natural world. He's an ecologist of supreme ability. He understands the complexity of our natural world. And so if I had 5 minutes with David Attenborough, I would say, David, you must realize that the message portrayed in that wonderful movie, which was so well done, but that message was partial. It was simple. It ignored the complexity of reality. And you, above everybody else, must realize that it's not as simple as that. And would you then be interested in coming on board with the UK fishing industry and making another movie about how far the industry's gone on the road to sustainability? Would you be happy to sit down with the industry and to call out the industry's shortcomings where you see them, but to acknowledge where it's made huge progress in fishing sustainably and having a much lower environmental impact than we used to have. So that would be my 5 minutes with him, would be that he's a very clever guy and he knows the complexity. But I would try to see, David, would you like to come on board and make a second Oceans film, giving perhaps a more nuanced and more accurate representation of the complexity of the reality of what we have?
Very fair. Here's a good question for an author. Which book or article do you think everyone in fisheries should read? And you're allowed to mention your own.
No, well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you, but I won't do that, Jim. I'm a huge admirer of Ray Hilburn and the work that Ray Hilburn does with his institute at the University of Washington. First time I heard him speak was at a conference, and it's the first time I'd ever heard that the carbon footprint of seafood was lower, so much lower than land-based proteins. Beef, it takes 60 kilos of CO2 to produce a kilo of beef, or greenhouse gases. It takes between 2 and 4 kilos of greenhouse gas emissions to produce more seafood. And of course, things like midwater trawled mackerel is less than 1. Farm mussels is 0.2. It's so much lower. I never knew that. I been in the seafood industry all my career, and I sat open-jawed listening to Ray Hilburn in his very, very elegant and very folksy American manner explain that actually seafood is climate-smart food. And ever since that day when I suddenly realized that, I've been a huge admirer of his work. We were lucky enough to have him in Shetland to do a public lecture, and he also came to Shetland to open the Centre for Sustainable Seafood, which is part of the University of the Highlands and Islands. So I'm a huge follower of his work, and his 2 books, Overfishing and Ocean Recovery, I would encourage anyone who has an interest in this subject, whether from the seafood industry or from the NGO community, or you're involved in the supply chain, or you've got a seafood restaurant, or if you simply like eating fish, read those 2 books. They're well written. He's written them with his wife, Ulrika Holborn, and they're well written, and they've certainly opened my eyes to what needs to be done. And like myself, Ray Hilburn is no apologist for the seafood industry. He calls out bad practice and he calls out where change is needed. But he lays very clearly on the line that we have a wonderful industry that's very efficient at producing high quality protein. And this is what we've got to do to make it better.
Excellent. One word to describe the future of British fisheries.
I've listened with great interest, as I do, to all the Seafood Matters podcasts, Jim, and I think most people, when asked this question on this particular series about banning beam trawling, have said challenging, and I would immediately choose that as well. But I'm not going to. I'm going to try and get beyond, I think, the feeling of dismay and despair that all of us in the seafood industry feel having watched Oceans. It's taking that simplistic solution to a complex set of situations. So the one word I'm going to use to describe the future of British fishing is I'm optimistic. And I'm optimistic because the British fishing industry produces a nutritious food that's good for us. We're extolled by the Food Standards Agency to eat more fish. It's full of omega-3, really good for us. It's highly nutritious. It's also got an incredibly low carbon footprint, and its environmental impact is so much less than so many other forms of food production. So we've got a great message to get across. So if we can get, as an industry, working with seafood podcasters, working with musicians, working with filmmakers, working with celebrities, we've got a great message to get across. Let's get it across so that we can convince the British public that seafood, UK seafood, is great. Then I think we do have a really optimistic future. The only cloud on the horizon is that I think we're all feeling very let down I think many people in the seafood industry, many people in the fishing industry felt that after Brexit, here was an opportunity that the UK government, a UK government, would look after the fishing industry better than the EU had. There was the disappointment of Brexit. Apart from the pelagic sector, the quota gains were very minimal. And then there was the terrible disappointment of the 12-year status quo, which Keir Starmer has just recently agreed to. No change, no annual quota negotiations that everybody had hoped would happen. And now we've had a UK cabinet minister saying that they're putting out a consultation paper to look at banning bottom trawling in all MPAs. So I think the performance of the British government in looking after our industry has not been terribly encouraging over the last few years. So that's my main concern. However, if we can as an industry, together with the NGO community and together with wider society, really get our message across, then I think ultimately I'm an optimist and I'm optimistic for the future.
That's excellent. And it's always good to have a glass half full person with optimism. I think that's great. It's been fantastic, John. Where can our listeners follow you online?
Well, I do. Since I started writing my books, somebody said I should have my own website, which I now do, where you can find out about my books. And I've got a kind of an occasional blog that I enter there. And I also have links to various lectures I've given and talks. So if anybody's interested in that, it's very simple. It's John Goodlad, all one word, lowercase, johngoodlad.org.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I think I'll just thank you very much and we'll fold up. So thank you, John. It was really good and it's great catching up again. You have a great point of view and you're well read and well thought. Thank you.
No, and thank you to you, Jim, for inviting me on again. It's wonderful to be part of this podcast, which I know is reaching an ever wider audience. So really important part of the campaign now to get the seafood industry, get its reputation up and appreciated by the British public. So thanks to you for having me on.
Thank you, John.